Good morning. We got a new day today and a new topic, topic 6. Today we're going to talk about predictors, and I'm going to break this down and say, we'll have two little sections here. One, an introduction to predictors, and then after that we'll come back and talk about types of predictors. Okay? And so selection of personnel, new employees, it's about prediction. And by the way, this is a selection for college too. When students apply for a university, the university wants to predict who will and will not be a successful student. Same thing here in IO psychology. They want to predict who will or will not be a successful job person, employee. Ha! Yeah, silly me. All right. And so if we knew who was going to be a good performer on the job, we wouldn't need to predict. So predictors are basically forecasting those criteria. Remember we talked about criteria in topic 4, one of the previous topics. I don't know. You probably know better than me. But we talked about criteria, and those criteria were criteria for promotion, criteria for firing, things of this nature. So in effect, a predictor is an attempt to forecast the criteria. Okay? Where is it? Here. I like this image. So here's how predictors work. Okay, there it is. We've got ourselves at the very top, what a surprise, a job analysis. Okay, so a good job analysis is at the beginning of these predictors. And as I'm positive you're going to anticipate, if this is not done properly, then of course the backlash of this is getting sued in a court of law. So a good job analysis is at the foundation of this. And we use job analysis to create job specifications where we of course break apart the KSAs that are involved in the job, and then perhaps take these KSAs and think about which things would predict the KSAs necessary for successful performance. But again, always starting with that job analysis. That's a critical part. So tests. A test is, as a simple definition, a systematic procedure for observing behavior and describing it with the aid of numerical scales. So again, in the same vein that we've been referring to, a test is an attempt to quantify a hypothetical construct. Okay, you've got hypothetical constructs, and we attempt to quantify them. Okay, so obviously you're familiar with some like the SAT test, but the personality test we'll talk in more detail. But even drug tests, because clearly, you'd have to do the job analysis to prove it. But I predict that if a potential new employee does in fact take a drug test and have drugs in their system, I predict that their job performance will be lower than somebody that does not have. It's pretty straightforward. What you're doing here is predicting. Okay, and so we'll talk about different, not types of tests necessarily, but ways that tests are administered, something of this nature. Okay, so to develop a test, you of course begin with a job analysis. You identify important criteria, you identify the KSAs associated with them, and then you develop tests to tap these KSAs. So just like that image. However, hopefully you don't develop your own, because I'm not doing test and measurement class or anything like that, but I can tell you if you develop a new test and you want to, a new test that you think will predict job success, you damn well better go through an awful lot of work establishing the validity of that test, because I can guarantee you if you do not establish the validity of that test, you will be sued. Okay? So thankfully there are a lot of measures out there that are already established, that are all validated. Okay? The Mental Measurements Yearbook, or another one is called Test in Print, although I don't know what they call it now because, of course, it's probably online. But the Mental Measurements Yearbook, it is a almost like an encyclopedia where you look up hypothetical constructs that you're interested in. Oh, I'm interested in conscientiousness. No, that would be a personality test. I am interested in dexterity. There you go. I run an assembly line and I need workers that have dexterity skills, fine motor skills. So you might look up D for dexterity or F for fine motor skills, and then you find a listing of different already established tests that have already been validated that you can then access. And so what we find is that these tests, however, the catch is they cost money, obviously, usually a per copy cost. And some of these things are really expensive per copy costs, and many of these things require very specific training. So there is, there is an advantage developing your own testing, but at the same time. And so we find that tests can be classified as computer adaptive testing, speed versus power, individual versus group, and paper and pencil versus performance. Okay, very briefly, computer adaptive testing. This was actually first designed by B.F. Skinner before there was even computers. All right, so it was pretty impressive. But he talked about learning machines that change in response to the user's input, something like this. And so what happens is that the questions on a computer adaptive testing usually start relatively easy, and then they get progressively harder. And then if you start to make mistakes on the progressively harder items, it brings back down. And so what it does is it kind of moves up, moves down, moves up, moves down until it settles on a pop. And this is your level, okay? So up, down, oh. And so hopefully the ups and downs become progressively smaller and smaller and smaller until it stabilizes. So they are believed to be very precise, by that highly valid. Speed tests are tests which are designed to be easy. They're really quite simple, very quick. It's just like, what's 2 plus 2? What's 6 plus 8? What's 9 plus 3? What's, something like this. And what we might do is take these simple math problems or something and simply put together 1,000 of these things. I mean, 1,000 simple addition problems, and then say you have 2 minutes, answer as many as you can. And the idea is the number of questions, 1,000, is designed so that you should not be able to finish them. Okay? The question is, how quickly can you finish a long series of relatively simple tasks? Okay? A typing test for clerical positions might be a good example of a speed test as well. Power tests, on the other hand, usually have either no fixed time limit or a very, very long time limit. But the items are designed to be much more difficult. And so most test takers are expected to finish every single item, but each item is much more difficult. Tests can be administered either individually or as a large group. Individually administered tests, as a rule, are more valid. As a rule, they are just better. Okay, but fact is they are a lot more expensive, right? They take a lot of time. Like the WAIS, the standard in intelligence testing, which we'll talk a little bit about in this topic. But the WAIS, a traditional WAIS, takes a lot of time. It takes a trained person to sit down one-on-one with a test taker, and it's just really expensive to do. But as you recall from topic 1, the history of IO psychology, during World War I, Robert Yerkes, Yerkes was hired by the U.S. military to come up with a cognitive ability test that could be quick and cheap and dirty. Remember the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. Well, another one that's real common nowadays is the Wonderlic, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Wonderlic personnel test again in the next video. And then finally, there can be a distinction between paper and pencil tests versus performance tests. Now, paper and pencil tests, this is an older phrase, and it's deceptive somewhat. Deceptive because it's not literally paper and pencil, though it can be literally paper and pencil. Like the GRE or the SAT used to literally be paper and pencil, but they're now administered on the computer. But that doesn't change the fact that they're paper and pencil tests. It doesn't involve paper and pencil per se, an individual test taker responding to these cognitive type questions. Performance tests, on the other hand, are tests which require the manipulation of some kind of equipment. Okay, and we'll talk again about various performance tests in the next video. Okay, so we'll stop there, and our next video is going to be types of tests. All right, we'll talk about cognitive tests, non-cognitive performance tests, etc. Okay.